When USS Texas was commissioned in 1914, she was considered one of the most powerful warships afloat. Built at the height of the naval arms race, Texas became a testbed for revolutionary U.S. naval technology. She was the first U.S. battleship armed with 14-inch guns, the first to mount anti-aircraft guns, and the first U.S. warship to control her gunfire with directors and range keepers. Texas was also the first U.S. battleship to launch an aircraft from her decks and one of the first ships in the U.S. Navy to receive radar. She is now preserved along the southeastern coast of her namesake state, where she stands alone as the last surviving example of a Dreadnought battleship. Overall, Texas is 573 feet long. At the time of her commissioning, she had a beam of 95 feet and displaced a little over 27,000 tons. As with most warships that had lengthy careers, these last two metrics increased after subsequent modernizations and refits, especially her 1925 modernization. Her main battery consists of 10 14-inch 45 caliber guns that are arranged in 5 twin turrets. Her secondary battery initially consisted of 21 5-inch 51 caliber guns that were located inside casemates along the sides of her hull and in open mounts next to her conning tower. And, like all U.S. battleships of her era, Texas had 4 21-inch torpedo tubes located below her waterline, 2 of which you can see in this photo. She was protected by belt armor that ranged from 10 to 12 inches in thickness, while her main deck was protected by 2 inches of armor. The New York class, which Texas was the second member of, was the first class to incorporate an armored central plotting room within their hulls. It should be noted that even though Texas was the second ship of the class to be ordered, she was actually laid down, launched, and commissioned ahead of her sister New York. Texas was initially powered by coal-fired boilers, and her class would be the last U.S. battleship class to be powered this way. Rated for 28,000 shaft horsepower, she had a top speed of 21 knots and a cruising range of 7,000 nautical miles. At the time of her commissioning, she was manned by 1,042 officers and enlisted men. Texas's keel was laid down in April of 1917 and she was launched a little over a year later. She was commissioned into the United States Navy on March 12, 1914, at the Norfolk Navy Yard with Captain Albert W. Grant in command. 2 weeks later, she headed north to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where she became the first ship in the U.S. Navy to receive modern rangefinders and fire control equipment. Instead of conducting a formal shakedown cruise and the subsequent post-shakedown availability period that recently commissioned vessels undergo, Texas headed for the waters off Veracruz, Mexico in May of 1914 to reinforce Rear Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher's force that had been sent in response to the detainment of 9 American sailors by Mexican authorities in the city of Tampico. After joining Fletcher's force on May 26, Texas patrolled and supported operations ashore for the next 2 months. After a brief return to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in mid-August, she found herself off Veracruz again in October, and she remained there until the end of the year. Texas operated with the Atlantic Fleet during 1915 and 1916. In August of the latter, she became the first U.S. battleship to be equipped with anti-aircraft guns when 2 3-inch 50 caliber guns were added to the platforms atop her boat cranes. When war was declared against Germany on April 6, 1917, Texas was anchored at the mouth of the York River, just north of Norfolk, and she remained in this general vicinity until mid-August, when she got underway for the Brooklyn Navy Yard. In the early morning hours of September 28th, while making her way to Long Island Sound where she was to meet up with her division mates, Texas ran aground off the northeastern tip of Block Island. The turn into the sound had been miscalculated. When the bridge realized that the ship was heading towards the shore, Captain Victor Blue ordered her engines in full reverse. However, by then it was too late, and when Texas finally came to a stop, about half of the ship was hung up on the offshore rocks. Attempts to lighten her over the next 3 days did little, and it ended up taking 3 tugboats to finally free her. The gash in her hull forced her back into the yard for repairs, which in turn delayed her deployment to European waters. The subsequent Board of Inquiry found that her navigator, Commander Frank Martin, was solely responsible for the accident. However, Captain Blue was also punished. Once her repairs were completed in February of 1918, Texas got underway for the Royal Navy Fleet anchorage at Scapa Flow. Her World War I service primarily involved blockade duty in the North Sea. Following the armistice in November of 1918, she accompanied the Grand Fleet to receive the surrender of the German High Seas Fleet. After escorting President Woodrow Wilson to France for the Paris Peace Conference in mid-December, Texas got underway for home. After an overhaul, she returned to duty with the Atlantic Fleet in early 1919. On March 10th of that year, she became the first battleship to launch an airplane from her decks, when Lieutenant Commander Edward O. McDonnell flew a British-built Sopwith Camel off of Main Battery Turret No. 2 while she was anchored in Guantanamo Bay. A few weeks later, in another first, Texas successfully employed her aircraft to spot the fall of shot during a gunnery exercise. In July of 1919, Texas reported for duty with the Pacific Fleet. She spent the next 4.5 years operating off the West Coast before returning to the Atlantic in 1924 for an overhaul. In November of that same year, she used her 14-inch guns to sink the hull of the incomplete Colorado-class battleship Washington, which had fallen victim to the newly signed Washington Naval Treaty. From July of 1925 to November of 1926, Texas underwent an extensive overhaul and modernization at the Norfolk Navy Yard. As you can see in this photo, the most notable changes to her appearance came from the replacement of her lattice masts with tripod masts, the relocation of 6 of her 5-inch guns to main deck casemates, and the addition of anti-torpedo blisters. Her fire control equipment was updated as well, and her coal-fired boilers were exchanged for oil-fired ones. Her torpedo tubes, which it was realized by now that they were just about useless, were plated over, and her 3-inch battery was increased to 8 mounts. After her modernization, Texas spent the rest of the 1920s and the early 1930s regularly alternating between the Atlantic and Pacific. One of her notable assignments during this period was transporting President Calvin Coolidge to the Pan American Conference in Havana during January of 1928. Then, midway through 1937, she became the flagship of the U.S. Fleet's training detachment, a role she would hold for the rest of the 1930s. In May of 1941, Texas began escorting convoys across the North Atlantic and did so for the rest of the year. When news of the attack on Pearl Harbor reached Texas that December, she was anchored in Casco Bay, Maine. She remained there until early January, when she got underway to escort another convoy across the North Atlantic. She then patrolled Icelandic waters until March. After a brief overhaul, Texas spent the summer of 1942 on convoy duty. Texas's first major combat operation of World War II was Operation Torch. In the early morning hours of November 8, 1942, Texas transmitted General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Voice of Freedom broadcast, which called on French forces along the Moroccan coast to refrain from opposing the Allied landings. Texas fired her first shots in anger of the war that afternoon, after she was called upon by U.S. Army units ashore to eliminate a Vichy French ammunition dump near Port Lyautey. In all, she expended 273 14-inch shells during the operation before departing for the United States on November 16th. Texas spent most of 1943 assigned to convoy duty in the North Atlantic. Her main role was to act as a counter to any German surface units threatening the North Atlantic shipping lanes. This routine continued into 1944, but ended in late April when she began preparing for the Allied invasion of northern France. Texas underwent her final preparations for the invasion in Northern Ireland during May, which included the removal of her airplane catapult and her Kingfisher floatplanes. It was decided that due to the perceived threat posed by German fighters, they would fly their spotting missions during the invasion using Royal Air Force Spitfires. On May 19th, General Dwight D. Eisenhower embarked and spoke to her men. On the 31st, the ship was sealed and a briefing was given to her crew about the upcoming invasion. Texas was designated as the flagship for the Western Naval Task Force and was tasked with supporting the landings at Omaha Beach. On June 3rd, Texas got underway for the French coast, and she arrived at her initial firing position 12,000 yards off Pointe du Hoc at 4:41 on the morning of June 6th. She opened up on the German positions at the top of Pointe du Hoc an hour and 10 minutes later and fired 255 14-inch rounds in just over 30 minutes before turning her main battery towards the western edge of Omaha Beach. By 9 a.m., the assault on Omaha Beach was very much in danger of collapsing, so much so that Texas and several destroyers closed on the beach. At one point, Texas was a mere 3,000 yards from the beach and firing her 14-inch guns with almost no elevation in an attempt to clear the western exit from the beach in front of the town of Vierville. The overwhelming fire support provided eventually helped to break the German resistance. The next day, Texas's CO learned that the Rangers on Pointe du Hoc were in serious trouble and subsequently sent ashore 2 landing craft full of ammo, food, water, and medical supplies. The Rangers then sent back 35 wounded Rangers and 27 prisoners of war. Over the next week, Texas supported Army units as they moved inland. Her last fire support mission came on June 15th, when several compartments within her starboard torpedo blister were flooded to provide a list of 2 degrees to give her guns enough elevation to complete the fire mission. After replenishing, Texas returned to the French coast on June 25th to aid the U.S. Army units that were attacking the city of Cherbourg. Her main targets were the 9-inch guns that were part of Battery Hamburg to the east of the city. Not long after noon, she opened up on the German positions. At 12:33, Texas was straddled by 3 German shells. She returned fire minutes later with a continuous stream of 2-gun salvos. At 1:16, a German shell skidded across the top of her conning tower, sheared off the top of the fire control periscope, hit the main support column of the navigation bridge, and exploded. The explosion caused the deck of the pilot house above to be blown upwards and wrecked its interior. Of the 11 casualties, only 1 man succumbed to his wounds, and that was the helmsman on duty, Kristen Christensen. He would end up being the only man to be killed in action aboard Texas. About an hour and a half later, an unexploded German shell was reported. The shell had crashed through her port bow directly below the wardroom and entered a stateroom but failed to explode. The unexploded shell was disarmed by a Navy bomb disposal officer in Portsmouth and is currently on display aboard the ship. Throughout the 3-hour bombardment, the Germans straddled Texas over 65 times, but she soldiered on and fired a total of 206 14-inch shells at Battery Hamburg before being ordered to retire just after 4 p.m. After undergoing repairs in England, she got underway in mid-July for the invasion of southern France. She arrived off Saint-Tropez during the night of August 14th and began her bombardment the next morning just before 7 a.m. Due to poor visibility, Texas relied on her SG radar equipment to determine her position and track for both navigation and gunnery purposes. The heavy opposition that was expected never materialized, so the landing forces moved inland rapidly. With her presence no longer needed, she departed on the morning of August 17th for the Brooklyn Navy Yard. While in New York, Texas underwent an overhaul to prepare her for the Pacific Theater. Her first assignment there was the preliminary bombardment of Iwo Jima. For 3 days, beginning on February 16, 1945, she hammered away at the small pork-chop-shaped island. She then provided on-call fire support after the Marines went ashore on the 19th and stayed in the area until March 7th. Then she headed to the island of Okinawa in late March and provided shore bombardment and fire support there until the middle of May. During her time off Okinawa, Texas fired over 2,000 14-inch rounds and over 2,600 5-inch rounds. After departing Okinawa, Texas headed to the Philippines where she remained until the middle of August. She briefly returned to Okinawa before getting underway for the United States on September 23rd. After participating in Operation Magic Carpet, she made her way to the Norfolk Navy Yard for inactivation in February of 1946. She was placed in the reserve fleet at Baltimore that June. On April 17, 1947, the Battleship Texas Commission was established by the state of Texas. The commission came up with the $225,000 that was needed to pay for towing her from Baltimore to San Jacinto. On March 17, 1948, she began the journey to her new anchorage, which was located along the busy Houston Ship Channel near the San Jacinto Monument. She arrived there on April 20th, and the next day she was decommissioned and turned over to the state of Texas to become the first permanent battleship memorial museum in the United States. Most of her final crewmen, only about 130 men by this point, were reassigned to the battleship Wisconsin after her decommissioning. But one man, Chief John J. McKeown, who had been serving on Texas since 1937, was discharged from the Navy the same day she was decommissioned so that he could become her caretaker. He subsequently lived aboard Texas and continued in his role until shortly before he passed away in 1970. Texas was designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1976. In 1983, control of the ship was handed to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department in order to better maintain and protect her. This effort resulted in a dry dock visit for Texas in 1988 that lasted 14 months and cost $15 million. While a lot of work was done to preserve her insides and make her watertight again, the big highlight was the 10 quad 40mm mounts that she received, some of which were salvaged from the Battleship Missouri during her recall to active duty a few years prior. Texas was reopened to the public in September of 1990. On August 31st, 2022, Texas was towed out of her berth for another dry docking. From what I have gathered through various publications and the Battleship Texas YouTube channel, the state of Texas and private donors have put forth about $75 million for her restoration work. For more information on the work that has been completed on her, as well as the work that is ongoing, head on over to the Battleship Texas YouTube channel. There will be a link to their channel down below in the description. They have been posting an update video every week so far in 2026 and have numerous videos detailing their ongoing and completed work. In fact, they just recently announced that Texas's new home will be alongside Pier 15 in Galveston, which is across the channel from where she is now, and they expect her to be open again sometime in 2027. If you made it this far, thank you. If you're a fan of what I do, please think about subscribing to the channel and possibly becoming a channel member. Early access to videos and members-only shorts are just a few of the perks that come with it. Once again, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.